Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Ramadan Journey. I am your host Afif Khan, and as usual on our journey we are accompanied by Imam Muhammad al-Asi. He is the author of the Ascendant Quran, which we have been referring to throughout our journey as sort of a guidepost and a milestone. We have been discussing Ahl al-Kitab and the various groups within Ahl al-Kitab, Bani Israel, An-Nasara, and so on and so forth. We ended our discussion yesterday by trying to understand the difference between theological Christians and theological Jews on the one hand, and political Christians and political Jews on the other hand. We just sort of began to talk about this distinction, and so now we'll go ahead and continue our discussion in that regard. And so, Imam, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Yesterday we got into one particular ayah, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu la tattakhidhu al-yahuda wan-nasara awliya. And you suggested that in this particular ayah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is referring to political Jews and political Christians. And you had just begun to talk about alladhina amanu as themselves being a political group, and thereby the reference in this ayah is to political Jews and political Christians. Could you begin to elaborate on that just a little bit, and then cite at least one ayah that describes theological Christians and theological Jews?
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. As-salatu was-salamu ala khatamil anbiya'i wal mursaleen. Rahmatullahi lil alameen. Muhammadin an-nabiyil ameen. Ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. I'll try to backtrack a few steps so that we can pick up from where we left off. We said that there's a self-inflicted ambiguity by the Muslims upon the Muslims, and that's in reference to our inability, our, meaning Muslims' inability, to distinguish between Jews and Christians who are not very much concerned with politics as much as they are very much concerned with theology. And there are segments of them that have the reverse being the case.
Now, before you go a little bit further, could you just briefly help us understand what you mean by theology?
Yes, it's the emphasis upon doctrinal, religious concepts pertaining to God Himself. Therefore, the Jews believe in one God, just like the Muslims believe in one God. That's a theological issue. The Christians believe, generally speaking, they believe in a Trinity. And there are other philosophical and doctrinal and explanational issues that go with all of this.
Okay, so now that we understand the meaning of what you mean by theology,
yes,
let's go on with the explanation.
So, as I was saying, that these people of the book, as they are referred to, folks of Scripture, they have this, it's a permanent feature of theirs. It's in their history, and it's in their contemporary setup, and I guess it will continue to be like this until Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala changes the setup of this triangular reality between Muslims, Jews, and Christians. So when it comes to the words in the Quran, al-Yahud and al-Nasara, that we mentioned earlier, these words refer to, in a very general sense, to al-Yahud refers to Jews, and Nasara refers to Christians. Even though some of them, I've come across some who don't feel comfortable with that designation, but that's the Quranic designation. It doesn't matter how they may feel about it. And the translators of the Quran use these two words without qualifying them, without looking at the fact that some people who belong to the Judeo-Christian context just belong to it by inheritance and by birth and these things. When they grow up, even though they may have grown up in a Jewish or Christian family, they are more of what you may call political animals than they are observant of Holy Scripture. These types have parted altogether their theological depths and taken on political configurations throughout the ages. In our time, these political configurations in the Jewish context are called Zionists. And in the Christian context, they are called imperialists. In the last 2 or 3 centuries, there was a precursor to the word imperialist, and that was colonialists. These were all ideological, political, philosophical theories and policies that describe certain people who come from these contexts. And this, I think, Muslims should wake up to this reality and distinguish between these two, so that when they translate these words in the ayat of the Quran, they make it clear to the reader, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, that there is a difference between ideological, political Jews and Christians on one side, and theological, doctrinal Jews and Christians on the other side.
Okay, thank you for clearing all of that up, and we're going to continue this discussion into the next segment. Please stay with us, we'll be right back.
Welcome Ramadan. Welcome Ramadan.
And welcome back. We've been talking about how the Muslims ought to understand the words al-Yahud and al-Nasara in the Quran. And so now I'd like to turn my attention to Allah's Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And did he have any contact with Christians and Jews during his 23-year mission? There is some evidence that he had contact with Christians in Mecca, and obviously he had contact with the Yahud in Medina. Could you describe that in a little bit more detail? And based on our previous discussion, were these theological Christians and theological Jews, or political Christians and political Jews?
Yes, he did. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He did have contact with folks of Scripture, Christians and Jews, both in Mecca and in Medina. In Mecca, when revelation first came to him, and he explained what happened in the Ghar Hira, when he listened to the first words of the Quran, اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق, etc. When he explained this to his wife Khadija, she suggested that they go and they disclose this information to a relative of hers. He was a scholar, considered to be a scholar in Mecca, a person by the name of Waraqa ibn Nawfal.
He was a Christian?
And he was a Christian. He had a reputation for being well-versed in the Christian information at that time. Now, this is a very important thing, I think, to mention here, and that is, at that time, in that part, because Christianity was spread throughout what's called today, quote-unquote, the Middle East. And inside the Christian communities in these different areas, there was a very serious contention as to the argument about the nature of Jesus, Isa alayhi salam. So don't think, if someone is saying, I hope and no one out there thinks that if we're saying Waraqa ibn Nawfal, who was a type of religious Christian scholar in Mecca, Christian religious scholar in Mecca, that what we mean by Christian here is today's theological and church words about Jesus. It was different because when Islam later on stepped out of the Arabian Peninsula into predominantly Christian areas, it resonated with Christians because it was part of their thought, part of their belief. And this is also expressed in the fact that when Muslims sought refuge in Abyssinia, the Negus, the ruler in Abyssinia, when he listened to Ja'far ibn Abi Talib present to him what Islam meant, he said that there's a very thin line. Basically speaking, that's what he said. He took his staff and he said, he put it on the ground and he drew a line like that. He said, it's something to the effect that the difference between us and you, us meaning the Christians in Abyssinia, and you meaning the Muslims, is no wider than this line that he drew on the floor.
Even at that time, this is probably 650 to 700 years after the mission of Isa alayhi salam. And even at that time, there was a divergence between Unitarian Christianity and Trinitarian Christianity. And so when Islam, as you were saying, emerged out of the peninsula, and it went into North Africa, it went into East Africa, it went into Yemen, and it also, went into what is now Syria and Lebanon, where the Holy Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, used to be. And so, where did Islam have an easier time penetrating? was it in the areas where Unitarian Christianity dominated, or was it in those areas where Trinitarian Christianity dominated?
Yeah, that's the whole point. You see, without going into details in in history that Christians developed, there was a serious type of polarization between the European understanding of Jesus Christ and the non-European understanding of Jesus Christ. And they had this conference around the year 324 because there was a lot of these concepts and arguments and disagreements that were going on. So I guess the Roman Byzantine emperor decided that, this has to come to an end. So they had this conference, and in this conference they agreed to certain ideas about Jesus and about the Gospels, because there were a lot of Gospels around also. And that eventually became the Trinitarian theology. But those who were still living in North Africa and Southwest Asia, they were not convinced. And many of them were persecuted. And it was in this context that the message of Islam began to touch base in these areas, and they listened to it and said, well, we feel more comfortable with this than the Trinitarian theological explanations that are coming to us from Europe.
So in a sense, when Islam came, it sort of liberated these people from their confusion.
It liberated them, and it gave them freedom of conscience and freedom of religion and freedom to be who they are.
Okay, and we're going to continue this discussion with regard to the Prophet's contact with Jews in Medina, and explore that a little bit in the next segment. We're going to take a short break. Please feel free to come back. We'll see you back in a few minutes.
Welcome Ramadan. Welcome Ramadan.
And welcome back. We're talking about the Prophet's relationship with the people of previous scripture. And now we're going to move on to the relationship of the Prophet with the Jews of Medina. Could you briefly tell us how the Jews got to Medina, and then describe the relationship they had with Allah's Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam?
Yes, there was unlike Mecca, there was a sizable Jewish community in Yathrib. Yathrib is the name of the city before the Prophet relocated from Mecca under duress and threats. He relocated from Mecca to Yathrib. So when he arrived, it was renamed Madinat an-Nabi, the city of the Prophet. And then that was sort of abbreviated and just called Al-Medina. So there was, as I said, a sizable Jewish community that lived in Al-Medina. Mecca was known for it being the cultural, the literary, the religious, and the commercial center of the occupants of all of Arabia. And Medina didn't have that character. Medina was more or less an agricultural city. And in that city, there was a sizable Jewish community. this Jewish community was divided into 3 sub-communities. They were known as Bani Qaynuqa, Bani al-Nadir, and Bani Qurayza. So when the Prophet came to Yathrib, i.e. al-Medina, he became the leader, obviously, of al-Medina. Now the Muslims had an independent and sovereign character, unlike the previous 13 years when they were persecuted in Mecca. And so the Prophet had to interact in the political and in the cultural sense, in the civic sense, with the Jewish community in al-Medina. And there was a document called Wathiqat al-Medina that was signed by the Jewish community in al-Medina, and in that document there was some details about the relationship between Muslim civil society and Jewish civil society. And you can detect in that the autonomy that was given to the Jewish community in al-Medina. But later on, as things would develop, Muslims were pursuing their God-defined responsibilities. As that was in progress, the Yehudi or Jewish community in al-Medina began to express its uneasiness and then its out-and-out objection to this nascent Islamic self-determination represented by the leader who is the Prophet, may Allah's peace and blessings be upon him and himself. And then the Jewish community in al-Medina began to enter into a type of working relationship with the Meccans, who were, in this course of time, the avowed enemies, the mushriks, the avowed enemies of this newly established civic and Islamic nation or city-state. And history developed in such a way that the Jewish community was dealt justice because of their position, culminating in high treason against the leadership of the Prophet and the committed Muslims. And eventually most of them left al-Medina and went and settled in the northern parts of the Arabian Peninsula in such areas as Khaybar and Taymat, and probably some of them went further north into Palestine and the Holy Land.
There's so much more to this discussion, and there's so much more to the relationship between the Jews especially and the early Muslims. But unfortunately we've run out of time to go into all of those details. But should you wish to acquaint yourself with much of that history and what can be learned from it, please feel free to acquire copies of the Ascended Quran. As you know, insofar as the longer chapters of the Quran are concerned, they deal a lot with the characteristics and the history of Bani Israel and the relationship of al-Yahud to the early Muslims. And So if you wish to go into any of that detail and you want to be better informed about that early history and the relationship that these people of Scripture had with Allah's Prophet, we invite you to go into the Ascended Quran and read as much as you can, and so that you are better informed. As far as this particular program is concerned, as we said, we've run out of time. We'd like you to join us again tomorrow, same time, same channel. This concludes our Ramadan journey for today. My name is Afif Khan, and inshallah I'll see you again tomorrow. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.